The heart as an organ of perception. Gut feelings are a particularly well-known way to refer to embodied resonance. They're generally recognized as having validity, even though the term has become a generic way to describe any bodily response beyond ordinary consciousness. The actual physical gut is the gastrointestinal tract, a central channel of nerves that transmits information throughout the nervous system. And it doesn't just signal satiety and hunger. The gut can alert us to danger or anxiety even before the brain registers it. All kinds of emotion and information transit through the gut. But did you know that the heart is an important organ of perception too? Like the gut, the human heart is sensitive to informational content that arises from outside as well as from within, since these aren't separate or distinct after all. Many of us know from experience about the heart's sensitivity to vibes. We feel the swell of emotion as a complex physical sensation, both the painful sensations of heartbreak and the expansive feelings of love. This isn't just metaphoric. We now know that the human heart is capable of transmitting and receiving vibrations and the information they carry, making it an important organ of perception and resonance. The brain and heart both generate measurable electromagnetic fields, but the heart's is far larger than the brain's, possibly generating about 60 times more amplitude. It turns out the heart's electromagnetic field can be detected and measured several feet away from a person's body. The amplitude of the heart's field might be responsible for what we call empathic intuition, when we perceive a vibe, mood, or thought as it arises in another person. Empathic intuition explains the intuitive resonance between parent and child, or any people who love each other. In any open hearted connection where awareness transfers without the need for language, intuitive channels are often more accessible. Our collective understanding about the heart as an organ of perception continues to emerge. Studies suggest that the heart registers intuitive information a fraction before the brain does. It's possible that the brain interferes with this transmission, cutting off awareness of it before we cognitively register intuitive content. The brain, trained over time to filter, judge, doubt, and critique, jumps on the experience before it reaches conscious awareness. Extrasensory perception. The sixth sense is what we colloquially tend to call the capacity to perceive through resonance. For some reason, we seem to make a distinction between a sixth sense, something that is at least somewhat felt or identifiable like a gut feeling, and extrasensory perception, when something is simply known, without any presence of a bodily feeling. But when we're talking about intuition as an embodied experience, what does extrasensory mean? Perception of vibrations is partly a matter of our sensory equipment. We know that human eyes can only perceive a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. We call that the visual spectrum and name what we can see as light. With sound, we know there is a much larger range than what we can perceive. Think about the high-pitched sounds dogs hear, but we don't. Dogs have a larger, more extended auditory range of perception. For what it's worth, they have a far superior sense of smell, too. And there are other wavelengths that humans don't ordinarily perceive. In fact, most of the range of electromagnetic frequencies is unseeable by the naked eye. Radio, television, cell phones, and Wi-Fi are all examples of energies we only perceive with technologies and tools that help extend our range of perception. But perception is also more than equipment. It's also partly a matter of how we direct our attention, how relaxed our nervous system is, what we expect to see, or if we're hoping to see something in particular. Sometimes, if we're looking too hard rather than with a quality of receptive awareness, it constrains our perception. It's like looking at stars in a night sky. The more relaxed and receptive our attention, the more stars become apparent, while focusing deeply on one area causes most of the other stars to recede from our awareness, literally becoming more difficult to see. By habit and convention, we exclude a lot of input, only allowing in a narrow band of what's available. The brain especially tends to filter out non-local energy, all that potential in the implicate order, since it doesn't even seem possible to perceive, even with the most sophisticated of tools. However, in non-ordinary states or in moments of intuitive flow, when we release the boundaries of convenience that allow us to get through the day in the seen world, we can sometimes access this unseen reality. Extrasensory or non-ordinary perception, like telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance, is possible because we also always coexist in the transpersonal, multidimensional, invisible world just as much as in the material domain. We just don't usually pay attention to it. And because consciousness becomes such a matter of habit, if we only ever attend to mundane, ordinary consciousness, that becomes the entirety of what we will ever perceive. This is important. Our subjective experience of perception is somewhat unique. Who we are, how we are, what we believe, what we pay attention to, things we've learned in our lifetime, our inclinations, inhibitions, desires, etc., all contribute to how we perceive in the outer world as well as in the inner and unseen worlds. Because humans are diverse, some people are naturally attuned to a wider spectrum. We also pay more attention to things we have strong associations to than things we're indifferent to. And in turn, what we pay attention to tends to grow in importance. What all this means is that to some extent, we can change the range of what we perceive. This is true of all senses, really. While we tend to think of sensing as innate rather than learned, cultural variations show us that senses and what we consider sensory or sensible are indeed conditioned and can be cultivated. For example, I grew up knowing as a fact that humans have five senses that more or less correspond to the holes in our head, plus our skin. We tend to think of these senses as universal, but other cultures register senses differently. I'm thinking of the Anlou of Western Africa, who recognize humans as having as many as 23 senses, including proprioception, the experience of our body in space, like knowing where to place your foot when walking, and the sensory experience of what foods feel like in the mouth. So, calling some things sensory and others extrasensory is a matter of convention and of culture. In a materially oriented culture, we make certain assumptions about what counts as a sense, but our assessment and categorizations can and should shift. Our culture is moving towards recognizing intuition as a sixth sense, and our science continues to demonstrate that most humans can perceive beyond the presumed five senses. One day, maybe it will become obvious that we have six or seven or eight senses, and what's now called extrasensory will just be known as yet another range of sensory capacity. Consciousness and non-local intuition. While some intuitive perception is a function of electromagnetic resonance, our heart, brains, guts are bundles of nerves that project and receive information from inside and outside the body. Other intuitive experiences happen as a result of non-local communication beyond the space-time dimension. And to understand that, we need to consider how we understand consciousness beyond the physical body. Countless theories exist for the what and how of consciousness. Thinking about consciousness is so difficult that scientists and philosophers just call it the hard problem. What makes the most sense to me is to consider that ultimately consciousness is what gets called the quantum field. In common language, consciousness generally refers to our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions of inner and outer experience, and our awareness of perceiving these. We can think of consciousness as an internalized map of the world. Its primary function is to create order so that we can perceive and then make sense of our surroundings and experiences. Consciousness sorts content, registering details, creating memory, and acting as a filter so we don't get overwhelmed by the enormous amount of input available to us. Behind the question of what consciousness is a more basic question about mind and matter. We know a lot about neuroscience and the brain, yet we still don't have consensus about consciousness. A rational materialist framing says that the brain is responsible for consciousness, a result of material processes like neurons firing, biochemical influences, etc. This kind of explanation works well for machines or anything we can take apart and reassemble, but humans are organisms, not mechanisms. And yes, our neurons do fire and biochemistry affects our experience, but we're neither passive nor static nor discrete. We are electromagnetic, interconnected, and dynamic. And we have energetic fields, our aura, and nervous systems that participate in non local coherence. So the materialist theory of consciousness doesn't reflect the complexity of what we experience. But a recent theory suggests that consciousness is a function of resonance. This theory suggests that resonance, i.e., synchronized vibrations, is responsible for consciousness along with everything we know and everything that is. Vibrations, it seems, are the foundation of physical reality in general, as well as our experience of it. The resonance theory of consciousness posits that synchronized vibrations are central not only to human consciousness, but to all of physical reality. Every physical object vibrates and oscillates, even objects that appear to be stationary. Ultimately, all matter is just vibrations of various underlying fields. When different oscillating things are close together for a time, they begin to vibrate in sync, a phenomenon called entrainment. This phenomenon appears to neurons. This phenomenon applies to neurons in brains, fireflies gathering, the movement of the moon and the earth, and far more. This spontaneous self organization is a manifestation of communication between entities, or you could say a manifestation of alignment and entanglement. The more synchronized these vibrations become, the more complex our connection with the world around us, and the more sophisticated our consciousness. Human bodies also emit or radiate vibrations of energy. When our energy resonates with the waveform of information, that interaction makes it possible to know things, even across or beyond distance and time, hence non local intuition. Intuitive experience can happen because of resonance between conscious and unconscious aspects of ourself, or between individual and collective aspects. Either way, intuition is something that happens to and through us as conscious, alive beings. Resonance depends on coherence, an alignment between ourselves, the perceiver, and whatever we're perceiving. The more coherent the emotional, attentional interest directed to the object of interest, the greater our access to the field of quantum non local information, and so the greater the intuitive connection. This isn't the kind of knowing where we can ever take ourselves out of the equation. Intuition doesn't happen without an embodied living knower who processes awareness and makes sense of what they know. Before I started to understand resonance entanglement and the quantum theories that ground intuitive experience as a function of resonance, I used to imagine intuitive perception as being like a screen grab. All the information, knowledge, potentials are out there somewhere. And for whatever reason, in some states of mind, we can capture a piece of that infinite awareness. We might imagine that some part of us stays connected to the Akashic domain at all times, roaming the vast dimensions of transpersonal consciousness where it perceives information, recognizes patterns, or gains understanding, and then sometimes offers that content up to the conscious, rational, language oriented mind for interpretation and meaning. Now I think of non local intuitive experiences like dipping a toe into the implicate order, accessing a moment of resonance with and as the soup of infinite potential, connecting to a slice of information before it has become explicit. Bohm explains that this toe dipping connection is made possible because energy is not static, but is a dynamic flux characterized by movement. And this movement is not simply a fluid flow, it happens in jerks, leaps, and jumps. It's random and spontaneous. It can happen in any direction. Within this movement, it's thought that electrons make virtual transitions. They spread out and test the waters of shifts before changing orbit. These virtual transitions are temporary, but they still create a probability wave, so they have lasting impact. This might be one key to how we can perceive something intuitively, plucking it from the realm of potential as it becomes manifest in the explicit world for a moment. The implicate has become explicit or actual for a very brief time, and we picked up on it, resonated with it. This also explains why there's some degree of uncertainty inherent with non-local intuition. Subjective perception. As we continue to discuss the logic of intuition through themes like resonance, entanglement, and non-duality, this seems like a good time to remember that where we stand to look at the world and the lens we use changes what we can see. Maybe it seems obvious, but any aspect of reality or experience can be approached from any number of vantage points. For example, think about the diverse ways to perceive a coastline. From a distance or on a map, coastlines seem distinct, more or less binary. There is the land and there is the water. With distance, it's reasonable to perceive that at some definite point, the land ends and the water begins. That's how a coastline appears with the lens of objectivity. But what do we see when we are at the coast or on the actual beach? What can we perceive from within the context of the beach itself? From that vantage point, we don't have the ability to see the shoreline in its totality, but a whole other range of perceptions do become available. Up close, our senses perceive a whole other range of information. We might see patterns in the sand left by the waves or by insects. We might notice that the sand is made up of particles of many shapes and colors. We might feel the breeze on our skin, smell salt in the air, hear seagulls fighting over an abandoned French fry. With this subjective lens, we're better equipped to experience a multidimensional, multi-layered sense of the coastline. The more we look, the less defined the beach seems against the water. More details and more nuances emerge, and any rendering of the coastline seems less and less accurate. At the beach, we can see that far from being linear and static, a coastline is complex and emergent. It's constantly changing with the ebbs and flows of tides. It interacts with gravity and with the plants, animals, and microorganisms that exist there. Not to mention, our very presence at the beach inevitably changes it in some ways. The pattern of waves shifting as water laps around our feet, our body's weight displacing sand. And so, if we're checking in on how accurate or valid our perception is, it becomes more reasonable to say that any representation of a coastline, even the ways we represent it to ourselves through our direct perception, is never completely accurate. It can't be, since it's always in the process of becoming a new version of itself. Our individual view of the shoreline is situated and contextual, shaped by where we stand, the coordinates in space, including how tall we are. Who we are matters in the act of knowing, although that's not a static equation either. We too are changed by the experience. At a beach, our eye color might appear bluer. Our body's composition becomes more infused with molecules from the beach. We interact with the beach. We are part of the beach. Our perception of anything can work this way too. The point is, whether we're at a shoreline or getting intuitive hits, we're always inextricably involved in the process of knowing. Perception is not something that merely happens to us, it happens within us. We have a role in creating our perceptions. In the quantum sense, we could say that perception is intraactive. As Raymond Trevor Bradley writes, quote, the act of perception generates an outgoing wave field of attentional emotional energy directed to an object of interest that interacts with an incoming wave field of energy from the object. The object and subject interact, creating a shift in both. We know this as the observer effect from the double slit experiment that demonstrated the wave particle duality of light. In this explanation of non-local perception, the body-mind picks up on non-local information by entering into coherence with it. We resonate with and as the thing we perceive and are changed by the experience of perceiving. Both and non-dual logic. When we accept concepts like resonance and non-local connection, we make room to entertain a different way to understand what knowledge is and even what truth is. And this could be really helpful when we want to understand intuition. Outdated assumptions about knowledge and validity lead us to think about the truth or correctness of intuition according to binary values. Is this right or wrong for me? But because of the non local, non dual nature of intuition, the answer might be both. Rather than either or, something might be right or good in some ways and not in other respects. Both and. For example, sometimes intuitive hits steer us towards growth, which can feel painful or awkward in the moment, but is ultimately beneficial. In that case, the binary question of yes or no is too limiting. Oftentimes, we perceive a whole intuitive vision, but don't get information about what to do as a first step towards creating that vision. Expecting intuitive experience to proceed in a linear way probably causes us to discount so many valuable hits simply because they're not appearing in the order we expect them to arrive or in the form we would like. As an uncertain and transpersonal process, intuition disrupts the binary of yes or no, is or is not. That's why it's important to refer to intuition as a process, a mode, or a way, rather than as a skill or a source. Intuition happens. As a dynamic relationship between the knower and the known, intuition thrives in a liminal space, somewhere in between. The process of knowing and the content of knowledge are not separate. As an expression of entanglement, where knowledge and the knower are not distinct, content and consciousness are entangled parts of a greater whole. We don't have an intuition or any knowledge. We interact with it in a holistic, unfolding process. We enact and are enacted upon by knowing. Whenever we say that something is, we reinforce duality. Something either is or isn't. But with the lens of dimensionality, we know that reality varies in different contexts. Depending on where and how we're looking, there are different functional realities. For example, on the micro level of particles smaller than atoms, protons, electrons, quarks, etc., the laws of physics appear to work differently. In the quantum sense, quantum objects are waves. The theory is pretty clear on this point. Until we observe them, they have, quote, neither a unique location nor a unique state. But when we measure those objects, we see that they are particles situated in space and time. This wave-particle duality is usually interpreted as the wave and the particle existing at the same time, but more accurately, the waveform exists outside of time. In our normal functioning reality, a table looks really solid, definitely solid enough to be painful when we stub our toe on it in the middle of the night. But we also know that table, as with every solid material object, is comprised primarily of space, of energy. Both are right. Newtonian physics, the framework that has supported our understanding of the physical universe, still holds up. And the quantum physics that blow Newton's framing out of the water also works. Both and. They work on different scales of experience in different domains. Identity works the same way. In the rational era, with our binary assumptions, we tend to frame ourselves as self-contained and independent. And to some extent, this is true, especially when we gaze out into the world and see things that aren't us. But the separated version of ourselves is only one way to understand our existence. In a quantum framing, the notion of the bounded singularity of a person or a psyche is not the whole picture. While it's true that I'm not the tree I see while looking out my window, we both exist within the same field that enfolds us and generates form. We, the tree and I, are connected and can even, in some states of mind, communicate. So, in this sense, self and other are not a binary pair. They're not even really separate at all. We don't even have to reach into ideas about the quantum field to see our interconnectedness. In very material ways, we all depend on each other for existence, for our very survival. We're not bounded singular identities at all. We are interconnected assemblages, systems within systems within systems. But non duality is helpful in explaining some experiences of intuition, experiences of energy awareness, empathic resonance, and psychic experience. In the unseen dimension, where I am not separate from you, our minds can be known to each other. Telepathy. I'm not separate from, say, a chair or that tree outside my window, and in moments of clear access to the undifferentiated awareness, field of consciousness, that we both simultaneously encompass and belong to, I can know if the chair is about to break or if the tree is about to get struck by lightning. Precognition. The non dual Akashic logic that helps us understand intuition disrupts a binary sense of right and wrong, correct and incorrect, because more than one thing can be true at the same time. Yet, even when we recognize that nuance intellectually, our habits tend to draw us into one or the other. We're so used to either or. The binary is so embedded, it becomes truthful. But by working to develop a habit of both and, we can come to realize that even if we don't always experience it this way, things can be separate and discrete in certain dimensions and be inherently entangled in others. Truth. By reckoning with intuition on its own terms, we create an opportunity to deepen our frame of reference for what counts as real and valid when it comes to, well, everything, including our experiences of conscious awareness. A quantum intuitive framework lets us extend what counts as truth beyond scientific materialism and helps us consider ideas and concepts that stretch our imagination of the nature of reality. Here's how that works. In the space-time paradigm, if we can't tell whether something is true or untrue, the presumption is that we just don't have enough knowledge about the thing. There's an underlying belief that if we don't know something, it's because we just don't know it yet. But outside of space-time, in the realm of potential, we accept that knowing might never come. The quantum field is inherently uncertain, and something existing in a state of potential doesn't mean it will actualize. Even the location of electrons is understood to exist within a field or cloud of probability. The best we can know is the probable location. That's why it's possible to intuit things that don't end up coming into being. We have captured knowledge of a potential. Within a quantum logic, we have to accept that there are some things we can't know in that same sense of knowing, but we still know them. We recognize this with intuition because intuition lets us know things we don't know how to put into language. Not being distinct or concrete doesn't mean something can't be true. Remember intuition's non discursive character. It's possible to know things that are difficult or even impossible to put into words. Here we bump up against the inconvenient constraints of the English language. Other languages inherently recognize different orders of knowing. There's knowing in the sense of connecting or relating, and there's knowing in the sense of I have knowledge of. In any language, the scientific approach tends to equate naming a thing with knowing it. It's almost like a form of ownership. But just because you know what to call something doesn't mean you know what it really is. Herbalist and philosopher Stephen Herod Booner makes the point that naming actually interferes with intuitive knowing. And even though I've argued against the imperative to know everything within the scientific lens, much of the quantum framework I'm talking about here has been and will continue to be demonstrated scientifically as time goes on. These things just take a long time sometimes. For example, a tiny material condensate, first proposed in 1924 by Bose and Einstein, was finally demonstrated in 1995. It took 7 decades for the instruments that could do this to be developed. We used to believe that laws of nature remain fixed under every circumstance, but these so-called laws have turned out to be not quite as fixed as we thought. Even the constant speed of light has been updated more than once due to refinement in measurement technology. Not to mention, the speed of light is not the absolute speed limit we had thought. Experiments with entanglement and bilocation show us that information can and does move faster than light. So, how do we recognize validity and correctness within an unfolding emergent context? How do we know what's true? When it comes to intuition, we can focus on the experience of being in the moment. Intuitive logic is not necessarily causal. It works with correlation, correspondence, synchrony, and other ways of making sense, and we can become more alive to those dynamics of resonance. We can recognize the complexity of connections and interconnections that comprise intuitive experience. We can trust that we don't have all the information yet and focus on the next right step. Quantum themes show us choices in the ways we can interact with intuitive experience. With a logic of indeterminacy, we can recognize there's something there, some information, some energy, some connection to be made, even if we don't know what it is yet. We can become increasingly aware of our interconnectedness beyond the boundaries of time and space we're used to experiencing. And we can learn to trust that an intuitive hit is informational, even if it doesn't reveal details or a definitive confidence. The logic shows us that there might not be one definitive answer. There are only answers, decisions to be made, and consequences. There are only forks in the road. A mode of resonance and connection. The quantum Akashic paradigm points us to a way of conceptualizing how a person can connect intuitively with knowledge across, through, and beyond the dimensions of space and/or time. Information in the form of energy exists encoded on waves in a distributed pattern, kind of like a hologram. Intuition works by resonance and by our conscious connecting with vibrational content we're not usually aware of. When we resonate to the vibration of a thing, we're intuiting or grabbing from the Akashic dimension. Then, when we're being receptive in flow, this content can become more accessible to our individual minds. Intuition, then, is a way of experiencing transpersonal or collective aspects of life, a multidimensional context that we're connected to because we're also embedded in it. This context is the foundation of consciousness, the realm in which we dream, find visions, hear voices, and participate in all manner of non-ordinary experience. On the level of consciousness, we are even more intricately connected than we realize to the transpersonal repository of archetypes, myths, and symbols known as the collective unconscious, and to the thoughts, feelings, and desires of other beings. And we remain connected to this dimension of consciousness as part of our makeup, even if we often forget the parts of ourselves that aren't merely contained in the physical form. With this in mind, one possible way to explain intuitive experience is that it relies on porous boundaries between our conscious awareness and our collective unconscious. We've only lost our sense of oneness, not the reality of it. Our oneness remains true. It's just in a dimension of experience we don't generally perceive or we tend to ignore. That means that cultivating intuition involves allowing more of what exists into our subjective awareness. Within a rational linear binary construction of knowledge, subjectivity is a liability. But with intuitive experience, the subject's interaction with the information, knowledge, awareness is vital. This becomes a countercultural stance to take because we're used to truth being achieved objectively, where the knower doesn't or can't matter. Trusting intuition on its own terms means choosing a framework for thinking about consciousness and connection that values human experience as a complex, holistic, subjective process, and that recognizes metaphorically that we are at a shoreline of our own experience, a dynamic participant in our own perception. With this framing, intuition is a function of connection to ourselves, to each other, to our situation, situatedness, to the cosmos, to our ancestors, to our descendants, to the elements, to the archetypes. Intuition demonstrates our intimate connection with all that is, all that exists now, and all that has ever been and will be. Intuition acts as a mode of connection between parts of ourselves we don't always have access to or realize we do, because it's all us anyway. The experience of non-ordinary states of mind enables us to feel connected to a collective unity that's composed of more dimensions than we can see or sense with any of our ordinary senses. This resonance can give rise to a sense of coherence and meaning. And honestly, it's no wonder we often attribute this knowing to a source outside of ourselves. It's that big. It's that amazing. But it's time to claim this as a feature and ability of human consciousness. We just have to recognize the dynamic, complex, holistic fact of existence. Is the new paradigm correct? Laszlo says, we don't know, but it's the best we can do right now. The intellectual territory we have to inhabit to let intuition stand on its own terms might not be logical, objective, or even scientifically valid in ways we're used to. So far, we don't have a definitive answer about how intuition works. And that's okay, because intuitive experience relies on the unique configuration of the intuiting person. Experience is subjective, and the entirety of our experience and context shapes how we perceive, know, and understand. Plus, as quantum theory tells us, things can only be certain in the abstract, or in other words, in a dimension of potential. We can speculate and make best guesses and even be quite sure about how true something is using calculations. But in the intuitive moment, what matters is your cultivated trust in the experience, regardless of how energetic sensitivity, precognition, or any other intuitive experience works. Once we're talking about actual things in the actual world, how they manifest becomes much less certain. Simply put, scientific certainty is only one kind of truth, since intuitive experience is often without language. And since each of us has different ways of registering what's taking place for us in the unseen dimensions, intuition on its own terms requires that we stretch our personal understanding of what it means to know. This has been chapter 3 of What is Intuition? Resonance, Connection, and Trusting Intuition on its Own Terms. Make sure you subscribe and have access to the whole playlist, the DIY audiobook.